I haven't seen the film for a while, but I think the other thing, which was there were two other things really, which is that this sort of Salieri character was in the film sort of portrayed to be sort of very impressed with Mozart, but if I recall rightly in the film, he's sort of, I'm not sure if you'd say plotting against him, but he certainly seems to be sort of overpowered with jealousy at Mozart's abilities, and probably sort of tries to sort of undermine him where possible. I think his wife in the film, if I remember rightly, is more or less portrayed as being quite supportive and taking Mozart along to chaperoning him to sort of interviews with influential people in the hope of getting work and stuff like this. I don't think there's anything in the film to suggest that his wife was up to any skullduggery, but I mean, having read all the letters, I mean, what, I suppose just starting with the first one, what do you think about those things?
Well, they're all debated points, and you can certainly get different opinions on them. The question of Mozart's character in daily life, you know, just dealing with the necessities. I tend to feel that some notes written by his sister after his death, he died very young, I think he was still 35. There was, of course, you know, quite a lot of a race to get some biographical material going, and one person wrote to Mozart's sister, who was perhaps 4 years older than he was, and possibly had always been the big sister taking care. Well, certainly they were got as far as London playing together as sort of child prodigies. And you know, her summary was, he was really always a child and almost just needed someone to cut up his meat for him at meal times. And you know, my feeling about her character, the sister's character, is that she's generally a very modest, quite restrained person, and certainly not someone going for sly digs or living in some kind of bitterness. So, you know, I suspect her notes written after his death, I think it was more or less in reply to a kind of questionnaire. Someone wrote a series of about 50 questions about Mozart, and you know, she just said how many simple weaknesses he had, that he could never deal with money, and I suspect that was all very realistic. So the reason some people wouldn't be happy with that is they say, well, we've got a guy here who, you know, has moved millions with his music, who can touch vital human emotions, who can characterize the figures in his operas, you know, with such ease, you know. So this is someone with the profound knowledge of human nature, you know, so he couldn't have been just some kind of kiddie out of his depth. And I just wonder whether both sides may be at least partially true, that within his own imagination, you know, he was quite happy dealing with dramatic situations, dealing with let's say, the smooth-talking baddie and seducer, and then the clever barber of Seville or whatever, and the old spinster or the young hopeful serving maid. So he could portray all these characters, I think, very effectively, and yet when he was actually in facing real life human beings, having to negotiate with them, I think it was just all too much for him. So I think, you know, a lot of contradictions there. He never says, that I can recall, anything bad about Salieri, and the only descriptions there are seem to be relatively friendly, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. I think there's some story of how Salieri had arranged to come round and pick them up in his coach and take them to some event or some performance, and they seem to be sitting together, you know, in a theatre box, and doesn't prove anything, but I suspect some of the material in the film is just imaginative. I don't think there's a lot of real evidence for this. I mean, he spoke about different musicians, and certainly one or two who were quite famous at the time, you know, he really condemned, and, you know, in scathing terms. But he also,
on a personal level, or their abilities as composers?
musically, yeah. But there were also other musicians that he seemed to genuinely praise and admire. So I don't think he was one of these guys who was so obsessed with being number one himself that he felt, you know, he had to talk everyone else down, or, you know, foul mouth everyone else in order to make them look, to make everyone else look sort of smaller or less gifted. So he was quite capable of genuine and warm praise of other musicians.
Who did he like the most and disparage the most? Do you remember?
Gosh, yeah, I'm just trying to. That might be risky if I try. There weren't names that are particularly known today, but, you know, some people who were famous at the time, and he just pulled them apart. So, you know, the picture of Mozart just sitting at the piano imitating other composers, I can imagine that's realistic. To what extent he would have dared to do it to their faces, not sure about that, but, you know, I think it reflects something of the way he saw the musical world.
With respect to his wife?
Well, if we're talking about musicians he admired, he really first of all wanted to marry, I think it was probably certainly the most famous of the daughters of the Weber family, Aloysia, and he really praised her as a singer. And, you know, he wrote when he was travelling. Most of the letters we have come from his travels, or during the last period of his life when he was writing from Vienna to his father in Salzburg. But there were periods of his life where there were more or less no letters because he was at home. And so when he was travelling, he arrived at Mannheim in Germany, and at that time, you know, a famous centre for music. And he said, oh, with this Aloysia, I just give her the sheet music of something I've written. She goes away and comes back 2 days later and does everything as I wish it to be. And, you know, he was always writing, oh, I'm getting on so well with this family, and I get on so well with the father. And he wrote to Mozart wrote to his father, describing how happy he was being with the Weber family and with this Aloysia, and if only he could get away from all this wretched stuff at court, and, you know, being polite and correct and formal, and he just wanted to get into a coach with Aloysia, and he seemed to be allowing for the possibility of other members of the Weber family, and just sort of drive off somewhere and just make music. And, you know, that's maybe just an example of, you know, how strong fantasy was. I think, you know, he couldn't sort of see why there's still the problem of, you know, someone somewhere has to be paying you, and alone paying for the upkeep of a coach, for example, but somewhere you're going to want to, you know, feeding horses underway. You know, the whole thing would have been a very expensive, really at that point in time, completely unrealistic scenario, but he seemed to be already fantasizing about that. He ended up, and this is where we get into the skullduggery stuff, the Weber family ended up moving to Munich because it's one of these questions of sort of royalty and succession. So the guy who had been sort of the prince in Mannheim got the chance to, or more or less inherited, the court in Bavaria, in Munich. So when Mozart came back from a journey which had taken him through Mannheim, and then he went on to Paris, when he came back he called in at Munich, and he was obviously hoping this was going to be the moment where he would, it's not described in detail, but he was probably going to propose to Aloysia, which in those days I suppose would, probably to be correct, you would start by announcing your plans to the father or whatever and getting approval, and he was absolutely destroyed after this visit to Munich. They obviously told him he wasn't getting you know, the wonderful singer daughter, and in business terms they were probably right. You know, Mozart at that stage wasn't earning a lot of money, and soon the daughter got a job at the court opera in Vienna, earning about 2,000 florins a year. Now, just as a comparison, I think you know, a simple violinist somewhere not right at the front of the section, but, you know, a couple of desks back in the section, might have been earning 150 to 200 florins. So, you know, she was a kind of real star, and the family seemed to have a good business sense when it came to such matters. Then later, again, maybe just naivety, Mozart went to Vienna, which is where Aloysia was, and at this stage the Weber family as well had moved there, probably in a sense living off Aloysia. The father had died, and Mozart just simplify it, sort of threw a tantrum and said to his employer, who was the Archbishop of Salzburg, who had taken Mozart with his musicians to Vienna for some grand event. So Mozart was taken with as a member of the entourage of the Archbishop of Salzburg to the Emperor's court in Vienna, and during that time he decided he'd had enough, just trying to satisfy the whims of this rather unmusical Archbishop of Salzburg, and he just said, okay, that's it, I'm not coming back with you to Salzburg. Then the problem came up, what do I do now? I don't think he actually used those words ever, but he ended up becoming a lodger in the house owned by the Weber family. And I'll just slant the statement a bit, but possibly, I think it is correct. The mother, Weber, decided Mozart might just be a good match for one of the less spectacularly gifted daughters. She did sing, this daughter, Constanze. No doubt someone of some musical ability, but not kind of star of stage and screen, so to speak, like Aloysia. And so Mozart ended up being in this house. In fact, they even owned two houses, I think, in Vienna, neighbouring ones, with a connecting passage. And it looks as if, again, interpreting, probably the mother started rumours which were so hefty that Mozart felt sort of caught or felt obliged to marry Constanze. And so I suppose that story, I suspect Constanze wasn't a great support to him. She wasn't highly polished. We don't have many letters just directly as she wrote them, because she tended to, after Mozart died, she started living with a guy who was actually a Danish embassy, I'll say employee, or an official of the Danish embassy. And from that point onwards, when she was dealing with the estate, all the music Mozart had written and who was going to publish it and how much would it be worth, all that correspondence was really in the hand of this Danish guy. And when you do see letters by Constanze, they're not very sophisticated and a bit rough. So I'm not sure she would have been the kind of highly polished, elegant lady at court kind of thing. So I can't think of any clear evidence that she supported him, and I think she may have misjudged quite a lot of people and then in contact with, because one of the things she tried to do was that when a biography was being put together by the Danish guy, they were still looking for more material, so they asked the publisher to print what had been written so far and put it in a book with every second leaf blank. And the idea is they were going to send that round all the people they knew in Vienna. and when they say, oh, I recognise that story, and they're just meant to write in something on these blank pages just to fill out the story, and no one wrote anything. And so I think
The implication being they weren't interested in doing anything for her specifically.
I think it could be that. I think it shows that she'd sort of misjudged the readiness of these people. She obviously assumed it was going to work. And I think what's quite possible is that everyone could see what had been going on, how Mozart came to Vienna, and again I'll just put this in sort of slightly melodramatic terms, sort of got trapped into marrying Constanza, that she sort of was somehow siphoning off more or less all the money he brought in. And she died a very rich woman, pretending to the last that she was a poor musician's widow. So it seemed to be a kind of almost compulsive behaviour with money. She had, you know, it was psychologically probably a kind of very freakish attitude. Well, there are plenty of people who love just piling up money somewhere and pretending they don't have it. So it's not so unusual perhaps. But I suspect this book just wasn't filled in well, people just had these memories of the roughly 10 years, I think, that Mozart lived in Vienna till he died. And I think it was probably just so hugely, it was possibly just so hugely embarrassing. They could see what was happening and they just didn't want to, or possibly the things that came to their minds weren't the kind of things they could write on these blank leaves in the book, I suspect.
Did anyone else know that Constanza was taking the money before Mozart died, do you think?
Well, there was I think fairly soon after he died, she made a very big loan to a musician and his wife in Prague, and seems to have been again a good bit of business with quite, I think, quite a good interest rate from her point of view attached to that. I think Mozart probably didn't have a clue what was going on with the money himself, and she spent really the year that he died, she'd spent a lot of time out of town, out of Vienna, in a place called Baden, which baths, you know, it was a kind of health resort with, you know, taking the waters and whatever, which wasn't a cheap thing to do, and she was there for months. And I suppose he didn't ask how it was working, how this was working financially. And there actually maybe some of his, certainly his saddest letters came out, because again there was separation involved. She was out of town, so suddenly we've got letters. So we don't have letters for everything in Mozart's life. But you know, he was trying to say, well, you know, we're going to get everything going soon, and don't you remember how we just used to laugh childishly and play and just be free, and you know, we're going to get those days back again. And at the same time he seemed to make sort of half jokes, which may mean that, you know, obviously thoughts were going through his head. There was some character who was never named, who used a Latin NN, I suppose we say never named, it's almost a good translation. So this guy has been seeing you and enjoying the time out there in the health resort, and this never named guy was probably actually one of Mozart's sort of private students who had been generally helping him, and when he was out of town, sometimes at Baden himself, then he would send this sort of private student into town and say, oh, bring me the score for such and such, and but he became a kind of messenger between Baden and Vienna, and obviously Mozart, you know, he made a few remarks which somehow sounded a little bit like jokes maybe, but you know, he seemed to be saying, well, what are you doing with this guy out there, and so on. So there was a kind of strange realism in my eyes about these last letters of Mozart, and really just in the last year or even the last months, and it's just as if he's saying, well, you know, how are we going to get back to this kind of, you know, childlike fun and freedom, and somehow it'll work. But there's just a sense of kind of loneliness, and I suppose it's maybe as if, you know, the shadows were sort of slowly closing in, and so it looks as if when he did die, you know, certainly his widow didn't go to the funeral. Generally it's accepted that he was just buried with the poor people, so there was often a kind of mass grave for that, and you know, almost certainly, I'm sure there was plenty of money there, but you know, this burial was just the cheapest available. Many years later, someone wrote to Constanza at a time when she'd gone to Salzburg by this time, and someone from Vienna said, you know, I just don't believe it could be true, you know, the greatest musical genius we've ever had, he died in our city, there's not a memorial anywhere, and there's nothing in the graveyard, and I'd be very grateful if you would give me some clue as to where his remains actually are. And her reply seems to have been factually quite flawed. I think she said something along the lines of, you know, having been looking after my poor sick husband in those last months, I was just drained and in need of help and recovering myself, and it was such a cold, snowy day, such a cold wind when he was buried, and I just couldn't go to the graveyard. And when I did go sometime later, when I was strong again, the old grave digger had died, and the new guy couldn't tell me anything about where he was buried, which all sounds, you know, perfectly plausible, but you know, people did then look up the weather records for Vienna, which were reasonably detailed, even in the 18th century. So the day of Mozart's death wasn't particularly cold. It was, beginning of December, but it was certainly, I think, a frost-free day. No particular wind, nothing particularly unpleasant going on. So somehow her story doesn't appear to be the truth, putting it quite bluntly. So it's pretty tragic. It's a sort of
So after she died, what happened to the money that had been?
Well, there were two sons. I assume it would have just gone to both of them. It was a sum getting on for just short of 30,000 florins. I think we mentioned that Aloysia back in the day was one of the top paid singers, I imagine, in Europe, with 2,000 florins a year. So when Mozart's widow died, leaving almost 30,000, 30,000 was the cost, more or less exactly at that date, of erecting the new State Theatre in Prague. So it was the kind of money you could do a lot with. And she, I assume, went on to her sons. Both sons were certainly pretty musical. One of them ended up in Milan. He was taking some conducting lessons there as well, but he then chose the option of becoming a state official. Milan at that stage was really part of the Austrian Empire, so he stayed in Milan and had a kind of functionary civil servant official job, and at the weekends he was a kind of hobby musician, would get concerts organised, conduct himself, and invite guests. So he was, obviously a capable musician, but moved into what one might call something solid in the way of the pressure. And the other son seems to be certainly a good pianist. Travelled giving concerts, was a piano teacher to a noble family in an area which in fact today might even be part of the Ukraine. It's sort of more or less Ukrainian Polish border, or Galicia, I think it's usually called. So he was a private music teacher in a household there, and travelled, seemed to have had a kind of, so on the one hand, a kind of sense for business opportunities, so he would perform works by his father, but would, which way around did he do it? I think he changed the name so that basically they appear to be works by himself. I can't remember whether it was by calling himself Wolfgang Amadeus or by renaming the composer, but he did come to play in places where Mozart had been active, and was a name. Came to, I think, Salzburg and Vienna, and described how warmly and with what enthusiasm he received there. Except if you read the newspaper reports, it seems to have been more small attendance and no particular enthusiasm.
So, I mean, do you think Mozart deserves his reputation as a sort of unparalleled genius, or do you think that's been slightly over-egged? I think you said Haydn had been very complimentary about him.
Yeah, well, Joseph Haydn, his brother was also quite a good composer, Michael Haydn, but Joseph was, I think, everyone appreciates that he was a great master. So he did attempt to give the much younger Mozart some composition lessons, and very quickly said, well, basically he can do it all. And I can't get the quote, verbatim, but it's, I've never seen such a, gift of God in any human being as in this Mozart. And he had certainly immense gifts. I think there's some things that he wrote where you just know he couldn't have been just sort of trying things out and saying, oh, that's quite good. Sometimes he just seems to have a picture in his mind of a whole kind of progression of where he wants to get to, and you think he must have really been hearing that, in advance, and he was just following what, in a sense, he was already almost shaping in his mind. But it's certainly also not true that he just did this kind of cerebral composition. We know that he wanted to get a keyboard instrument into his lodgings in Paris, because he obviously did often sit and compose. But you get the impression he's someone who could really almost mould things like clay in his musical mind, and something sort of almost complete and perfectly rounded off seems to have come out often. You've got to be careful on that, because I think there are a couple of quotations of Mozart's which have been used to suggest that he always just had this whole entire picture in his head, and then I think at one point he said, I've composed it, but I haven't written it out yet. And so people assumed that meant, he's got everything in there. He's just got to do the slow, boring job of putting it all on paper, which I think is true to a certain extent, but it's probably meant more like, I've got the main melody, or the vocal part and the text, the soloist on the top. Quite probably I've worked out the kind of foundation, the bass line and the harmonies, but I've now got to orchestrate everything that's in between those two. So in a sense you could say composing it would be knowing the most important lines, the solo melody and the bass foundation, and from those really it's clear what harmonies he's working with.
I mean, I mean, what? I'm not sure if you're actually a Mozart fan or not, but I mean, what's your favourite thing that he ever did? Do you think?
Well, I think probably one of his most famous works actually involves a certain amount of imitating Bach. His C minor Requiem. It was a very imposing work, very monumental, and at the same time it seems to be consciously copying some Bach ideas as well. But I think often I think that there are two or three factors. There's just this effortlessness, when he's moving onwards. He never does a kind of very blatant take idea A, put it up a couple of notes higher and play it again, and then put it in the minor key and then finish the piece. So, it's never just sort of stuck together like assembling, putting a wall together with various regular sized bricks. So there's always something very natural, organic in the way the piece grows, and it just has this sort of effortless way of doing that. I think another quotation which is possibly does say something, there's a kind of musical joke about the angels in heaven, and when they're on duty they play Bach, and when they're off duty they play Mozart. But I suppose it's, in some ways you could say it's often more worldly than, well, if we're talking about Bach, just comparing the vast amount of the church cantatas written by Bach, there's nothing quite like that in Mozart. And Mozart spent so much time obviously on, let's say, worldly subjects in most of his operas and so on, even if they did have a kind of religious dimension to some extent. But within that sort of worldly context, it's certainly extremely inventive. And as I say, he never does anything that's and completely predictable. That somehow you can see it's related to what's gone before, or you can see how it continues to what comes afterwards. So there's relationship there without it being just sort of crude reuse of material or whatever.